Hi, I'm Stax, and in this video, and the ones following it, I'll attempt to cover some of the topics I mentioned in my last video in greater detail. Today's topic being the setting of Mount & Blade Bannerlord. I've had some great responses to my last video, which in case you haven't watched it is linked on the screen right now. Some of these comments pointed out mistakes I'd made, which I'm all for, please keep them coming, but therefore part of this video will be dedicated to correcting myself and adding further information. Throughout this video, I'll be playing music associated with each faction in Bannerlord. The faction whose music is currently playing will be displayed in the corner, like so. So let's jump right into it, shall we? And what better way to start than with a quote. So here we go. Bannerlord is set 200 years before warbands. Players who followed warbands lore will recall that Calradia was once an empire, which declined and was supplanted by successor states. Tribal confederations turned kingdoms, much as the Western Roman Empire was supplanted by early medieval states. Since warbands was set in the 13th century, we can assume that with Bannerlord taking place 200 years earlier, that it will be set somewhere in the 11th century, and such the equipment and architecture will draw inspiration from that period. Now that quote clears up a criticism that I had in my last video, namely, it's set 200 years before warbands. Yet, as you will see, they have more advanced technology. So somehow between this and warbands, they have regressed technologically. I get that this is simply an inevitability when you set out to improve an existing title, but they chose themselves to set Bannerlords before warbands, and so far I haven't seen nor heard any good arguments for why this is the case. The loss of technology over time is not uncommon in our history in the real world. In England, for example, after the Romans had left, the Saxons had no idea how to build and maintain the stone structures that the Romans had built, so they were simply left to crumble, while the people lived in wooden houses. With that in mind, it makes total sense that some knowledge and technology would be lost amidst the violent crumbling of an empire, as portrayed in the Mount & Blade series. Moving swiftly on now to the correcting myself bit of the video. In the last video I said this: the factions in Bannerlord are as follows, and sorry if I butcher any of these names. Sturgia in blue, Batania in green, Northern Empire in pink, Western Empire in orange, Valandia in red, and Kusite in brown. After further looking into this, I found a new, more in-depth list. What prompted this mistake and subsequent exclusion of some factions was the source here, which I thought was mentioning all the factions in the game, but it turned out was only listing the ones visible in the video. My bad. The following is a full list of the factions in the game: the Valandians, the Sturgians, the Assyri, the Kurzites, the Batanians, and the Empire, which itself is split into 3 factions, the Southern, Western and Northern Empire. On the map in the background here you can see the factions roughly in their starting positions. As it appears to be after a certain amount of play in the campaign, I cannot say how close this is to the exact starting positions. Taking a closer look now at the individual factions, starting with the Valandians. They used to be tribes who have now turned to a feudal society, quite renowned for their heavy cavalry. They're clearly very inspired by Western knights of the period, and are the precursors to the Swadians that we see in warbands today. Moving on down the list, we have the Sturgians. They're focused on infantry combat armed with swords and axes, and are very inspired by the Vikings. They live in the northern forests and are the precursors to the Nords in warbands. Next up we have the Assyri, focusing on infantry and light cavalry. They live in the desert and are inspired by the Middle Eastern warriors at the time, and they are the precursors to the Serenid Sultanate in warbands. Moving on to the Kurzites. They're masters of mounted archery and are clearly based in the Mongolian armies. They live on the steppes and are the precursors to the Kashid Khanate in warbands. Up next, we have the Batanians, who live in the forests and therefore are masters of forest ambushes and archery. Now, based on where they live on the map, I'd say that they're Rodoks, but based on their focus, I'd say they're Vagians. I'm gonna have to go with the Vagians, and you'll see why in a minute when we talk about the Empire. So, coming up next, the Empire. So, the Empire. They're located somewhat in the middle of the map, and being the oldest and therefore most war-honed faction in the game, they're masters of combined arms warfare, meaning that they're essentially jacks of all trades but masters of none. Now the reason why I think these are the Rodoks is that it mentions specifically spears in the description, and I know that Rodoks use spears. Also, the location is somewhat close to where the Rodoks are in warbands, so that's why I go with that. But that is just my opinion. To help give each faction more flavour, they have been divided into smaller clans, each with their own goals and ambitions, which of course will lead to disagreements and minor infighting. Furthermore, lords have been given a distinct personality which will influence how they act, so hopefully now they won't all just be the same quest dispenser with a different appearance. Minor factions have also been added, which will comprise of outlaws and mercenaries based on historical and legendary groups. Not much else is said in the post about these, but since they're referred to as minor factions, I take it that we can interact with these and maybe even hold some sway over their actions. Also, does this mean we get Robin Hood? Last but not least, the start of the game has also been changed. In previous installments of the series, the player was given a short chain of quests, intended as a tutorial on how to gather soldiers and fight. In Bannerlord, this quest chain will instead be used to set up the narrative and give the player a tour of the different factions so they can make an informed decision on who to fight for. Well, that's all I've been able to dig up about the setting. I guess all we can do now is wait for the game to come out so we can explore it for ourselves. I wonder when that will be.
Anyone else?
Okay, have we got a release date yet? How long before I'll be able to say, shut up and take my money?
We were waiting for this question. Okay, so we want to have it in some form, whether it's beta or how whatever we do, we want to have it in some form in the players' hands this year. That's what we're going for.
Well, stay tuned to the channel. Combat is coming up next. This has been Stax, signing out.